I grew up in Owatonna. Lived there with my parents, had a younger brother. Lived in Minnesota my whole life.
Rob Stewart is not the most familiar face at the Minnesota State Capitol, but he has been working to change that because there's one legislative issue in particular that's affected him directly.
So I want to start by thanking Secretary Simon for making the voting rights restoration for felons a priority, because this is a very personal issue for me and for tens of thousands of other Minnesotans.
A few years ago, Rob made the decision to share his story with the public, and it's a story that's really all too common in Minnesota.
I started drinking and using drugs in high school, and it progressed downward, kind of a downward spiral over a period of time. And it was in my mid-20s when I was active in addiction, and I was using methamphetamine and other things. And I was arrested a couple of times for drug possession. I spent about 2 years in prison, and then the remaining part of my sentence was on supervised release. It was 100 months total.
It was during the second phase of Rob's sentence, when he was no longer in prison, that he began to notice the many barriers that stood between him and a full return to society.
I knew that I couldn't vote, but I still wanted to engage in like the precinct caucus process. So I showed up at a precinct caucus, and and there I was, sitting around with my neighbors and the whole thing. And then they read the rules, and one of the rules is that you can't participate in the precinct caucus if you are not eligible to vote.
For those who study criminal behavior, meaning academics like Christopher UGGEN from the University of Minnesota, Rob's experience at the precinct caucuses was a missed opportunity to help him stay on the right path.
That's right. So voting is clearly tied to recidivism. We know there's a very close correlation, and particularly when I looked at a cohort of individuals who were released from Minnesota prisons, that once they started voting, they were extremely unlikely to get into trouble again. The voting makes you a stakeholder in a very serious way in the community.
The research Professor UGGEN is referring to, which was outlined in this 2018 study, it doesn't draw a direct and causal relationship between voting and improved behavior, and yet the data is being leveraged by those in support of returning voting rights to, as advocates phrase it, those who have left jail behind.
There is hard evidence out there that when you return and restore the right to vote for people, they feel more invested in the community and they are less likely to reoffend.
For those who don't support the effort, it's largely a matter of Minnesota's unique sentencing culture, a culture in which we avoid sending people to prison by leaning heavily on community-based solutions.
The other thing is that Minnesota is not an incarceration state, it is a parole state. Okay, so we do a lot less prison time, and part of your sentence is to finish all of that probation, and automatically, when you're done, you automatically are restored to all of those rights, including voting.
So Minnesota is off the charts in terms of its probation.
Sarah Walker, who supports the effort, views these long probations as exactly the reason reforms are needed.
People often think, oh, you're on probation for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Not in Minnesota. In Minnesota, it is not uncommon for a nonviolent offense to be on probation for 10, 20, sometimes even 30 years.
Walker has also argued that the current policies have a ripple effect across generations.
We also know that political participation is a learned behavior. It's something that's passed down. Most people, like me, had their first experience at the ballot box by going with their parent. And so I think we're unintentionally also potentially disenfranchising future generations.
According to Senator KIFFMEYER, the goal may be a good one, but the more appropriate approach is to reform sentencing guidelines.
Quit with the heavy punishments in the first place so that they aren't on probation so long, or that we have a different kind of focus. That kind of compassionate approach is one that I would support.
As Senator KIFFMEYER went on to tell us, we also have to consider the long-standing tradition in Minnesota that election law will not be passed without broad bipartisan support.
The governors in the past have said there has to be substantial bipartisan votes for any election law changes. This subject does not have that kind of level at all.
Beyond the policy perspectives, there's also the political calculus, which does come up in many private conversations in St. Paul.
And quite frankly, I can tell you behind the scenes, many politicians from both sides of the aisle will say, who is this going to benefit or who is this going to hurt? And in some states, I'm not going to lie, it could have a partisan advantage. But most of these are based on racial assumptions that overwhelmingly African Americans vote for Democrats, or overwhelmingly another group votes for the Republican Party. But the reality of this is that Minnesota is unique because we don't have a very large African American population relative to a state like Florida. The actual numbers of people who would be re-enfranchised are overwhelmingly, again, from greater Minnesota and Caucasian.
Altogether, the demographics and geographic distribution of our state have led Professor UGGEN to conclude that Minnesota wouldn't see the same partisan impacts as many other states.
We found in elections, for disenfranchisement to really make a decisive difference, it has to be a very closely contested election in a state that has a very strict disenfranchisement regime. The numbers in Minnesota are often not at that level to where it would shift an election, but we certainly saw that in Florida Senate elections and the 2000 presidential election, that disenfranchisement could have made the difference.
In short, the people who would really benefit, well, they look an awful lot like Rob Stewart, a guy who's already moving on with his life.
And so I'm married. I have a 14-month-old. I live here in the Twin Cities now because I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Minnesota in sociology.
Which means, ultimately, for Rob, the now PhD candidate and father, this entire legislative debate is about helping people like him step more quickly away from their past.
When people make the choice to go out and vote, they're signaling that they care about the direction and the future of their community. The more that we can encourage people to feel invested, the less likely those people are to return to the criminal justice system.